morning and good evening for those of you joining us from different parts of the world. I'm Jisoo Kim, Director of the GW Institute for Korean Studies and Korea Foundation Associate Professor of History, International Affairs, and East Asian Languages and Literatures. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to our third annual North Korea Economic Forum. We were hoping to host this conference in person since GW is back on campus this semester, but we thought it was premature to host in person considering that this is an international conference where we have speakers attending from Europe, Japan, and South Korea. From the second annual North Korea Economic Conference, we began to publish North Korea Economic Foreign Policy and Research Paper Series. This publication is available on our GWIKS website. Last year's papers were based on invitation only, but this year we announced a call for papers and selected 6 highly qualified papers based on many applications we received. So we plan to publish these papers again this year. I would like to first thank our sponsor, KDI School of Public Policy and Management, for their generous support for supporting our policy program, which this North Korea Economic Forum conference is part of. I would also like to thank our distinguished speakers, presenters, and discussants for joining this year's conference. Without them, we could not have hosted this virtual conference. My special thanks to the North Korea Economic Forum Steering Committee for organizing this conference. Finally, but not least, thanks to Yeonho Kim, Associate Director of GWIKS, Sean Dahlen, Program Manager, and Kim Estoke, Program Assistant, for all their hard work in making this conference possible. Now I would like to introduce our honorable guest speakers to give their congratulatory remarks. I would like to first introduce Dean of the LU School of International Affairs at George Washington University, Alyssa Ayers. Dean Ayers is a foreign policy practitioner and award-winning author with senior experience in the government, nonprofit, and private sectors. From 2013 to 21, she was senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations, where she remains an adjunct senior fellow. Her work focuses primarily on India's role in the world and on US relations with South Asia in the larger Indo-Pacific. Her book, Its Place in the World, was published in 2018, which is about India's rise on the world stage. And Dean Ayers is also interested in the emergence of subnational engagement in foreign policy, particularly the growth of international city networks, and her current book project tentatively titled Bright Lights, Biggest Cities, The Urban Challenge to India's Future, examines India's urban transformation and its international implications. The book is currently under contract with Oxford University Press. And from 2010 to 13, Dean Ayers served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia. Dean Ayers was called for jury duty today, and so she could not make it this morning, but we are very grateful for her sending us a video.
Thank you, Professor Kim, for that kind introduction, and welcome everyone to the 2021 North Korea Economic Forum on the topic of ideology and economic policy in North Korea. The annual North Korea Economic Forum was first launched in 2019, featuring the theme of change versus the status quo. This year's conference will continue to provide participants in Washington and beyond with a unique opportunity to understand the North Korean economy from a holistic perspective. Drawing from a variety of academic disciplines and subject matter specializations, this conference will examine the role that ideology plays in shaping and constraining economic policy and economic life in North Korea, both in today's Kim Jong Un era and through a historical lens. The inauguration of the GW Institute for Korean Studies, GWIKS, in 2016 was a formal recognition of the importance of Korean studies at George Washington University, especially in the policy field. Not only is our mission to educate future policy experts and leaders who will go on to develop careers in government, academia, industry, and more, it is essential that in the nation's capital we provide the Washington policy community with a deep bench of experts who can provide a variety of perspectives about the Korean Peninsula. I'd like to thank our co-sponsor, KDI School of Public Policy and Management, for providing a grant to GWIKS to make this conference possible. As a result of their generosity, GWIKS is able to host a series of high-level Korea-related events, as well as to provide scholarships and stipends to GW students. Thank you. And now I'd like to turn to my KDIS counterpart, Dean Yoo Jong-il, who will give brief remarks. Welcome, Dean Yoo. We look forward to future cooperation and to opportunities for deeper exchanges between our universities. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a wonderful conference.
All right. Thank you, Dean Ayers. She'll be with us tomorrow morning to moderate former Deputy Secretary of State Stephen Biegun's keynote speech. I'll introduce her again tomorrow morning. All right, next is Dean KDI School of Public Policy and Management, Jong-il Yu. Before taking a professorship at the KDI School of Public Policy and Management, Dean Yu taught at University of Cambridge, University of Notre Dame, Macon University. He also had visiting professor positions at University of California, San Diego, and University of Beijing. Dean Yu is widely published in such areas as economic growth and income distribution, macroeconomic and development policies, and labor issues. He has been active as a policy advisor and served as a member of the Presidential Committee on Northeast Asia Economic Hub and chaired the Special Committee on Economic Democracy of the Democratic Party. He also served as a member of the Public Funds Management Committee, the Advisory Committee for the Constitutional Revision Committee of the National Assembly, and the Commission on Financial Administration Reform. As a leader in civic movement, he's currently the head of Knowledge Cooperative for Good Governance, a network of researchers, and the president of Jubilee Bank, an NGO working to help debt-stricken low-income individuals. Dean Yu graduated from Seoul National University and received his PhD in economics from Harvard University. Dean Yu also sent us a video from Korea to deliver his congratulatory remarks. We'll now turn on his video.
Dr. Alisa Ayers, Dean of the Elliott School, Mr. William Brown, Chairman of the North Korea Economic Forum, co-host of this event, fellow researchers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. As the co-host of the North Korea Economic Forum annual conference, and on behalf of KDI School of Public Policy and Management, I'd like to express my warmest welcome to all of you. It's a great pleasure and honor to host this conference with our colleagues from the GW Institute for Korean Studies, GWIKS, and have an opportunity to meet scholars and experts on North Korea from around the world. Allow me to take a moment to thank GWIKS for being such a wonderful and productive partner. Our collaboration, I believe, has enriched education and research in Korean studies in the US, co-hosting this annual conference being an important example. Let me now express my sincere gratitude to Dean Alisa Ayers for taking the time out of a busy schedule to participate in today's event. And if I may, belated congratulations for appointment as Dean of the Elliott School. I also want to thank Mr. Stephen Biegun, former U.S. Deputy Secretary of State, who is a well-known figure in Korea because of his role as the U.S. Special Representative for North Korea. I look forward to listening to his keynote speech tomorrow. Last but not least, I'm grateful to all the distinguished speakers and participants for taking the time to join this conference. The theme of this conference, Ideology and Economic Policy in North Korea, is very appealing to me. We will have a discussion on mass mobilization, social commerce, and marketization today, and on globalization, economic aid, and foreign media tomorrow. I hope this conference will advance our understanding the role of ideology in shaping economic policy and explore various aspects in social and economic life in North Korea. Ideology and interests, I believe, are the two fundamental driving forces that shape economic practices and policies. I'm curious as to how the specific features of economic life in North Korea may be understood in this light. In particular, marketization of the North Korean economy is an extremely important and interesting topic. We know that markets have grown more important and become an indispensable component in North Korea ever since the Great Famine and economic crisis of the 1990s, when the public distribution system nearly collapsed. However, a marketization of the North Korean economy has failed to deliver significant economic results in terms of increasing economic growth and raising standards of living that we have seen other cases of marketization in formerly centrally planned economies such as China or Vietnam. One possible answer may be the harsh sanctions imposed on North Korea. But another important factor seems to be the restrictions on marketization imposed by the North Korean authorities themselves, perhaps in order to maintain the scaffoldings of a centrally planned economy. One may say I am naive if I said that I hope to see North Korea improve its economic performance and people's standard of living by utilizing market mechanisms more widely and more wisely. I hope the discussions today will help us find ways to make such a scenario even slightly more likely. Some people talk about deglobalization after the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted the global value chains. However, the astonishing extent of globalization, especially the instantaneous connectivity of the information economy, is here to stay, I believe. Today, no country, even North Korea, can be completely isolated from the outside world. For a country like North Korea, handling news and information from outside is a difficult and delicate issue. Tomorrow, we'll hear about how external events such as the global financial crisis are interpreted and propagated by the North Korean state media, and how foreign media has influenced the North Koreans' attitude toward economic policy. I also look forward to learning more about the curious experiences of North Korea's economic aid in Africa. I have noted the critical role programs like today's conference plays. We do not know what the future holds in terms of inter-Korea relations or the nuclear issue between North Korea and the US, but we need to be sure that we do whatever we can now to prepare for a constructive engagement and cooperation with North Korea when the time comes. I hope that our conference will continue to serve as a significant venue for such a preparation by deepening our understanding of North Korea. Once again, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome and express my sincere appreciation to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Yu. Our next speaker is Bill Brown, who is currently the chair of the North Korea Economic Forum at GWIKS. He's also principal of his consulting company, Northeast Asia Economics and Intelligence Advisory, and is adjunct professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, where he teaches courses on the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean economics economies. Mr. Brown served a career in the federal government, working as an economist and East Asia specialist at the Central Intelligence Agency, Commerce Department, and National Intelligence Council. At the National Intelligence Council, he served as Senior Research Fellow for East Asia and as Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Economics. His most recent service was as Senior Advisor to the National Intelligence Manager for East Asia in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Mr. Brown's research is focused on the North Korean and Chinese economies, and he's widely quoted in national and Korean media, especially with Voice of America. His publications include Money and Markets in North Korea, an unclassified study for the National Intelligence Council, and the Economics of Korean Unification, published by the Council on Foreign Relations. Please welcome Mr. Brown.
Thanks, Jisoo, and everybody here. Welcome to this. Really, for me, it's just a wonderful occasion looking at ideology, history, North Korea, and policy all put together. What an exciting morning, and tomorrow morning as well. One thing I always say about North Korea, I always say it's about the easiest place in the world to be an expert on, especially as an expert. I can make up any kind of number or any kind of theory, and nobody can prove me wrong. They can challenge me, and they do, of course, but they can't prove me wrong because there's so little information out there. But the more you look into this issue of North Korea, the more you find how incredibly complicated it is, and how uncovering stuff, there is a lot of information out there, especially historical information, even some data in refugee data. A lot of it is in Korean, and a lot of us Americans miss that. So here we have several panels here of experts, or people learning to be experts. And we need to pay great attention to them with putting their papers through a critical sort of scientific test. The interesting thing about North Korean ideology to me is there are really two parts to it. One is socialism, of course. The other, of course, is this idea of self-reliance, or GWIKS, as they call it. The two are fundamentally opposed to each other, if you think about it, socialism and self-reliance. So here we have, I think, what to me ends up a very dysfunctional system of these two opposing ideologies. It ends up with two prices for everything. And as a result, a lot of inefficiency and a lot of corruption that end up making very poor use of the country's really strong assets. Most importantly, it's very strong human capital. So here we're going to learn in the next few hours, and then tomorrow morning as well, some path-breaking research into the earlier periods of North Korea, how it set itself up this way, and from this maybe we can learn what it needs to do to change, and how we can try to help make that happen. Okay, so let's move on to our first panel.
Right. Thank you, Bill. I very much look forward, as all of our honorable guest speakers mentioned, I look forward to learning about North Korean ideology through today's presentations and discussions, and also, of course, tomorrow. All right, without further ado, I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Celeste Arrington, Professor Celeste Arrington.
Thank you, Jisoo and Bill, for that introduction. And I think Bill set up this panel very well. My name is Celeste Arrington. I'm Korea Foundation Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at the George Washington University. And one of the great pleasures has been watching this North Korea Economic Forum grow over the past 3 years. And so I'm pleased to moderate what sound like 3 very interesting papers this morning. Let me just begin with a few logistical points. I'm going to ask our distinguished audience today to please submit your questions into the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. And then when we have simultaneous interpretation later in the panel for our second presenter, the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen will allow you to select English or Korean. And without further ado, I'm going to begin by introducing our first paper this morning. Ellie Kim is a faculty member at the Ramapo College of New Jersey, and the paper is entitled North Korea's Gambit of Marketization, Historical Resonances in the Socialist Legitimization of Market-Oriented Practices. And the discussant for this paper will be Susie Kim, who is Associate Professor in History at Rutgers University. So let me turn it now to Ellie.
Okay, so hello everyone. First, I'd like to thank the North Korea Economic Forum for inviting me to this meaningful conference. My presentation title is The Gambit of North Korea's Marketization, Historical Resonance and a Socialist Legitimization of Market-Oriented Practices. I use the term gambit to illuminate the historical repercussions of North Korea's path to marketization. In the discourse of North Korea's marketization, most analysts and academics have predicted the eventual demise of the Kim's leadership due to economic liberalization, or North Korea's deviant path to market economy different from other former socialist countries. Although these analysis provide an insight into North Korea's current political and economic situation. These assumptions are fundamentally based on the idea of North Korea's peculiarity and, more importantly, neoconservative scholar Francis Fukuyama's thesis of ultimate triumph of liberal democracy, while maintaining the Cold War ideology of superiority of capitalism over socialism. Most scholars dismiss two salient questions. First, how does North Korea, which defines anti-capitalism as its quintessential post-colonial identity, legitimize market-driven economic policies? Second, how does North Korea's path to economic liberalization or market socialism resonate in the trajectory of modern global history? So for possible answer to these questions, rather than interpreting North Korea's marketization as a sign of a sudden swerve from a socialist economy caused by its political instability, I trace the socialist discursive strategy and the adaptation of a mixed economy. So while theorizing socialism as a transitional period, the Soviet Union provisionally allowed capitalist practice to bring rapid industrialization, but securing socialism within a capitalist world system. Based on this geopolitical and theoretical background, socialist intellectual legitimate the embracement of capitalist economic principle as a temporary expedient for economic progress and development. However, the socialist gambit of enduring market practices imagined socialist countries in a perpetual transitional stage from socialism onto to communism, and redefined the 20th century state socialism as a socialist welfare state. So as you know that North Korea is known as the last bastion of upholding the socialist economic system, the people of North Korea's gambit of marketization is not a possibility of regime collapse. It is the end of envisioning the realization of socialist utopian modernity, human emancipation from labor exploitation, and economic equality that socialism promised. But at the same time, it is toxic for new historical stage beyond neoliberalism. So I like to discuss first the major scholarships on North Korea's marketization, and I will give you 3 examples of North Korea's marketization. So as you know that there has been a decade-long tradition and discussions of imminent collapse of North Korea. Recently, scholars tended to break away from this old tradition. A well-received argument is the informal civilian economy, such as Changmarang is the origin of North Korean marketization, which arose during George March. In contrast, other scholars emphasize the role of Kim Jong Un in leading major economic reforms after 2010s. Lastly, some scholars speculate a spin-off effect, which explain North Korea's possession of reliable nuclear arms reduced its military spending and redirect funds to civilian market. So these scholars opine various perspectives on North Korea's marketization in terms of cost, direction, and repercussion on its regime. But they undermine an important questions of how North Korea justify the ideological discrepancy, market practices in a socialist economy. So in order to gain possible answers, I turned my attention to North Korean intellectual. Different from intellectuals of others former socialist country who played an important role leading political and economic liberalization, the longevity of Kim Il-sung's dictatorship deprived intellectuals of producing counter-hegemonic discourse against the state. Although North Korean intellectuals produce state ideology, their role is also to serve people for the improvement of material and cultural condition. So North Korean intellectuals' discourse on economic reform reflects the conflicting interests between the socialist state and the people. So in this section, I'd like to discuss the 3 examples of continuity and shift in North Korean intellectuals' discourse on the mixed economy. So among North Korea's economic reforms since 1998, the 2012 announcement of Socialist Corporate Responsible Management System, called 사회주의 기업 책임제, is considered the official statement of North Korea's partial marketization. This system granted the complete autonomy of enterprise with a state overall planning. The enterprise not only gain the right to sell, export their product on their capital necessary to executing the plan and they decide pricing, but also they are responsible for their material loss as well. So this system seems to suggest North Korea's sudden departure from a socialist economy to partial market economy. However, the socialist corporate responsible management system is an advanced version of self-financing management system. It's called 독립채산제, which was first introduced in 1948. 독립채산제 also granted partial management rights and a production control to boost our economy. In fact, the 독립채산제 or self-financing management system was modeled after Soviet new economic policy. The new economic policy was allowed privatization of small enterprises and land holding under state control. It was the first attempt at the mixed economy to bring economic development and compete with capitalist countries. So this gambit invited many features shared with capitalism: production, distribution, consumerism, exploitation, and etc. So the geopolitical limitations of the 20th centuries of socialism and its strategic move in turn entrapped the socialist country in a liminal sphere. North Korea also adapted capitalist economic principle to fulfill its modernist vision. So although the socialist corporate responsible management system was a significant leap toward introducing an element of market economy, North Korean intellectuals have repeatedly emphasized the limited market practice as a temporary means to pursue practicality in the time of a transition where socialism coexists with capitalism. But in recent years, many the intellectual also stress material incentives as an important tool to motivate people's ideological inspiration. So in this way, they assiduously reinforced collectivism as an ultimate goal of the economic reform. So economic changes also transformed North Korea into quite an active consumer society. The Pyongyang's brand new subway trains displayed advertisements for heart medication and children's goods on their screen. In fact, the traditional socialist theory regards commercial advertisement as an unnecessary adversary. In reality, socialist industrialization inexorably imbibe the production, distribution process, consumerism, and advertising industry. So like other socialist countries, the North Korean government has published wide-ranging advertisement in regional newspapers and economic-related journals since the 1950s. So as you can see on this screen, various advertisements such as red pepper paste, bean paste, tofu, candies, chewing gums, and medicine, supplements, etc. appeared in commerce and Kaesong newspapers. The earlier advertisement accentuate educational or information functions, so including basic information about the ingredients of the product, the name of the producer, location that where the product is available, and occasionally the price of the product. So in 2009, North Korea aired Daedonggang beer commercial on Joseon Central TV. This commercial reflects both capitalist and socialist characteristics. Different from quick wholesale nature of advertisement in capitalist countries, it has a 2 minutes and 40 seconds of long airtime to provide information about the product. Starting with the advertising slogan, the pride of Pyongyang, that informs viewers that beer relieves stress, improve health and longevity, and goes on to give assurance to beer's quality and nutrition value. This commercial also demonstrates that branding has been an important value and competition is undoubtedly growing in North Korean society. So in promoting a heart of capitalist marketing tool, advertisement, North Korean economists assert a moral ground, the superiority of socialist advertisement by differentiating the role of advertisement in capitalism and socialism. They maintain that socialist advertising has a people's welfare at heart and serve a pragmatic device for North Korean economic prosperity, while capitalist advertising is concerned exclusively with enrichment of individual and entrepreneur. The last example that I'd like to address is one of the most noticeable changes brought by North Korean marketization, which is the rise of new social stratification. So emergence of a new class of private entrepreneur known as donju demonstrates growing economic inequality in North Korean society. Donjus are the newborn rich of North Korean society who take over state mines, farms, factories, and help the finance of building booms in Pyongyang. Although the term donju doesn't appear in official print material, the North Korean people experience the vast gap between the donju and common people. Then how does the state justify the existence of capitalist elite in a society that gains legitimacy from ideology of economic equality? So in case of China, Deng Xiaoping intentionally fostered the economic elite by openly announcing, let some people get rich first. China's state capitalist approach embraced private entrepreneur as a public or collective economy of market socialism. It is possible that North Korean people implicitly accept the success of donju as a sign of North Korea's economic prosperity or recognize their role in bringing economic development. In other words, seeking to make a profit is no longer understood as anti-reactionary behavior. Rather, one's active participation in market practices would be a token of socialist patriotism. However, a more important thing to note is that the cozy relationship between powerful entrepreneurs and the party indicates a strong capitalist elements that appears both market socialism and neoliberalism. As proven in China and Vietnam, market socialism brought economic development. Yet it also withdraw socialist promise of welfare system and economic equality. The ending my presentation, I'd like to offer my final remarks. Through the historical and theoretical analysis of socialist mixed economy, I aim to demystify the stark dichotomy between the capitalist and socialist economic system, and to rethink the role and characteristics of 20th century socialism in modern global history. Then what does North Korea's path to economic liberalization imply in the age of neoliberalism? In particular, the COVID-19 pandemic vividly exposed the maladies of neoliberal market economy, mass incarceration, income inequality, plutocracy, healthcare crisis, and hyper individualism, etc. The gambit of North Korea's marketization suggests the end of envisioning not only a socialist utopian modernity, but also capitalist modernity, since both modernist visions share progress and development as their ultimate goal. So I like to finish my presentation with Brechtian maxim. Don't start from the good old thing, but the bad new one. I hope that examination of North Korean marketization revives the discourse on a new historical paradigm beyond the modernist ideals. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Ellie, for this fascinating and nuanced analysis of some of the contradictions in North Korea's marketization in the context of a socialist economy and the cognitive dissonances that North Koreans live with today. I'm going to turn it now to our discussant, Susie Kim, but let me ask you to put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will take them after the 3 papers and the 3 discussants' comments. Okay, so I beg your patience with that process, but Susie, go ahead.
Great, thank you so much. I prepared some written remarks because I wanted to make sure that I stayed on time. So I'll just kind of read, if I may. I'm actually really grateful for this chance to read and comment on Dr. Ellie Kim's work. I've learned a lot from her dissertation on the role of intellectuals and the theorization and practices of decolonization in North Korea between 1948 and 1967. And so I'm delighted to meet her in this forum. Her new research is in many ways, I think, picking up on this earlier thread from her dissertation by situating the recent so-called turn toward marketization in continuity with North Korean strategy for decolonization, and hence her use of gambit to frame market-oriented practices within socialist discourse rather than as a radical break with the past, as most scholarship on this topic frames it. I sympathize with this move and found this a potentially productive way to understand how and why North Korea continues to maintain a firm position and grip on a command economy despite the market reforms. And I was particularly taken by the argument that certain market practices are part of a transitional stage from socialism to communism. Or one could also say a transitional stage from socialism to capitalism, depending on where you think the trajectory is going. I was left wondering, though, whether the methodology used in the paper could fully hold up to the argument it wants to make, and found that the language sometimes slipped into the very dichotomy that it aimed to overturn. With the aim of expanding debate and in the spirit of productive critique, I offer some suggestions for further thinking, and my remarks are given with the understanding that Dr. Kim may have very well thought of these already, but may not have been able to elaborate for lack of time today. Her paper aims to investigate, quote, North Korea's discursive strategy in legitimizing its seemingly contradictory economic policy that is embracing market practices while abiding by the socialist ideology of collectivism. And here, socialist intellectuals play a critical role as she considers them a medium between the state and the people, who can thereby implant market mechanisms within a socialist planned economy through their discursive strategy. The significance of such a study, as she explains, is that socialist and capitalist economic systems may not be so starkly different as they are often framed. So that is to say, it's often framed as one taking place at the expense of the other, so that the turn to marketization is evidence of failure of socialism. And by seeing them in parallel, rather, in her case, and in conjunction, socialist countries are rightfully placed in the context of modern global history and within the capitalist world system, as she noted in her conclusion. This is a compelling thesis in my view, and there's a lot to unpack. So first, since the intellectuals as economists are the central agents in this history, it would be helpful to learn more about them. I was kind of left curious about what their backgrounds were, how they were educated, what their careers were. Who are they, in other words? Who are they beyond being agents in the production of state and ideology and responsible for conducting serious research on the real lives of the people? This is a quote from her paper that I read to prepare for the remarks today. Is there a way to trace their intellectual history as authors and contributors to the journals that she introduced to us in economic studies, the Commerce, the Journal of Kim Il-sung University, to see shifts in their arguments? How do their arguments compare to those made within other state socialist countries before economic liberalization, before 1989? Providing this context will be key to show just how their discursive strategy could actually implant market mechanisms within a socialist command economy. But even with this context, there is a more fundamental methodological assumption driving the argument that requires explanation. And I think this rubs up against a pervasive challenge in the research on North Korea more generally. How do rhetorical strategies get translated into actual practices and policies? How does discourse become market mechanism, in other words? Because of limitations on fieldwork and access to empirical data, research on North Korea usually has to rely on official North Korean publications as the main primary source. Although sometimes these are accompanied by North Korean refugee testimonies, such as the former director of the Kaesong Industrial Complex that she introduces us to in her paper. I don't think she was able to go into that during the talk today, but it would be interesting to hear more about that. This by default leaves researchers to focus on discursive strategy, that is the official line of the state, but without the hard data on how this gets adopted into market practices, we're left with only one side of the equation. In order to make up for this lack, scholars like Andrei Lonkov and others have relied heavily on defector and refugee testimonies, but there are limits to how much aggregate generalizable data can be gotten from individual and personal experiences. And as many other scholars have noted, the sample of the refugee testimony tends to come from particular regions of North Korea, and so that also limits the generalizability, I believe. As a result, Dr. Kim is in some ways forced to draw a rather sweeping conclusion that in North Korea, the authoritarian dictatorship prevented any counter-hegemonic discourse, while in the Eastern European prevented any counter-hegemonic discourse from arising, as in the Eastern European context, where the intellectuals were prime drivers of liberalization as an expression of anti-Soviet sentiment. But doesn't this again reproduce the oppositional framing of socialism and marketization that she was trying to avoid in the first place? In that sense, perhaps it's worth asking where this persistent dichotomous oppositional framing of socialism and marketization originates. Scholars have typically framed North Korean marketization this way, as Dr. Kim shows, but at times it seemed as if she herself inadvertently ends up adopting this framing by posing the question, quote, how the state was able to articulate the conflicting ideology of socialism and a capitalist market economy at the same time, end quote. If, as Dr. Kim argues, socialism and capitalism should not be framed as dichotomous, then the question is not how conflicting ideologies were articulated together, but what is the historical role that markets have played in socialist command economies, And how should markets and marketization be defined? My own answer to this is that markets are inaccurately conflated with capitalism in almost all of the literature. But historically, markets predated capitalism and have been in existence as long as human beings have had to exchange some items for others for survival. My understanding of capitalism comes from my reading of Marx's Capital, according to which money and markets are not sufficient, even if necessary conditions for capitalism. It's only when money can make more money in the form of capital that we can speak of capitalism. Setting aside whether that is actually happening in North Korea today, markets have been part of the North Korean economy since the beginning, as in other state socialist economies, as Dr. Kim rightly points out. The mere existence of markets in no way negates the foundations of a command economy, and socialism and marketization are not contradictory in my view. In fact, aspects of so-called marketization, such as private household plots and new management methods adopted by reforms in North Korea in the last 20 years, can be found throughout its history since the beginning. As Dr. Kim points out, as early as 1948, North Korea adopted a self-financing management system, 독립재산제. The use of household plots to address local consumer demand was also a ubiquitous part of the command economy, and the wage system in North Korea has always been differentiated and tiered according to labor intensity and productivity. While commercial advertising may seem new to North Korea, there were various forms of advertising throughout its history too. And in a moment, after I finish, just in a second, I'm going to drop a link in the chat to a really fantastic volume that was published in South Korea just last year that talks about this history of commercial advertising. There's a tremendous historical overlap in the development of commercial advertising and political propaganda using some of the same tactics and strategies. So returning to the original thesis of the paper, I wonder whether we could productively encourage the paper's intent to see marketization as part and parcel of socialism. Rather than seeing marketization as a gambit, then, might it not represent the recognition of the need to balance collective welfare with individual incentives and interests that have always been part of the socialist experiment? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Kim, for those insightful comments. For the sake of time, Ellie Kim, is it all right if we move on to the next paper, and in the Q&A you can respond to Susie's comments? Great, thank you for the link also. So without further ado, we're going to turn now to the second paper, which is by Junhee Lee, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Yonsei University in Seoul. The paper is entitled "The Establishment of North Korean Socialist Commerce and the Role of Private Merchants." So here again, it sounds like we will investigate some of the existence of capitalist-like practices in early socialist economics. Bill Brown will serve as the discussant for this paper afterwards, but without further ado, let me turn it over to Lee Junhee. Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your introduction. Can I share my screen? Yes, my title is the establishment of North Korean socialist commerce and the role of private merchants, 1945 to 1950. This picture is a postcard in colonial era in Pyongyang market. This picture theme is the Korean market crowded with white dressed Koreans every day. I need to show a real Pyongyang market in colonial era. So today I will talk about the very beginning of North Korea style socialist commerce. In the middle of the 1990s, North Korea food crisis was more serious than ever, and the arguments much began. Since then, a lot of experts started to expect collapse of North Korea. Many experts have suggested 장마당 as a sign of collapse. However, As we know, North Korea leadership is maintaining their regime from the time to today. Experts are only interested in when they predict the breakdown and North Korea society and the aftermath of the breakdown. At that point, I was curious by what they mean by collapsed system and what the origin structure of North Korea commerce is. The previous studies have focused on the view that North Korea controlled private retailers. I agree with these arguments to some extent, but they did not fully analyze commerce system that North Korea government intended to build. When we study the North Korea commerce system called socialist commerce, we can finally realize where existing retailers come from. Also, we can get information how retailers survived in North Korea. I tried to find out evidences from North Korea history. From a historical point of view, I will explain that under 3 themes, especially North Korea government's commercial policies, the state commerce system, such as state shop and consumer cooperatives, and market and retailers. As we know, after liberation, the Soviet Civil Administration, SA, and Provisional People's Committee of North Korea jointly governed North Korea. At the time, North Korea's political and society status was rapidly changing. Many Koreans who chose that socialist society came back to North Korea. Additionally, the Soviet army and their families and Korea인 who received order from Soviet government came to North Korea. The North Korea politics and society were complicated. Back in July 1945, the Japanese originally had a store enterprises took up around 85% of commerce community in Pyongyang. After liberation, Japanese went back to their country. After that, North Koreans took over Japanese positions. And then the market was thriving, but the market experienced a shortage of goods. This was a big problem that was caused by too many people coming into North Korea. The North Korea government was not able to guarantee their minimum living. The North Korea and SA could not control the market that circulated won, dollar, ruble, and Soviet military notes. Especially the big problem was that Soviet army and their families spent too much the Soviet note, and it resulted in inflation in North Korean market. To stabilize the market, SA considered of applying a new commercial system that Soviet wanted. This was the socialist commerce, which was the same as the expression that North Korea government people called 민주상업, 민족상업. SA began to control the market. They officially investigated all merchants, capitalists, and manufacturers, and then imposed tax to prevent the expansion. However, in fact, it was not strict, and many merchants thought it was manageable. In March 1946, North Korea government announced the 20-point platform. North Korea aggressively interfered the market, intending to socialist commerce. They tried to educate their people that socialist commerce, this is good for them, and it can assure minimum living. Because North Korea can eliminate the bad merchant who is exploiting farmers and workers. After that, the commerce system is going to be fair, and then people's lives will be stable. The North Korea organized and distinguishes 2 market systems. One was the government organized market. This is simple. This market was impeccable because private merchant cannot participate, so it could be totally safe. The North Korea goal was gradually expand this market. Another was private market at the time. But the reality was not easy. Let's look at the table 1. In December 1946, private retailers accounted for 96.5% of all products distribution. However, North Korea tried to decrease private retailers based on their big factory that produced a lot of goods. On May 20th, 1946, consumer cooperatives was established in Pyongyang. CC have exist since the Japanese colonial period at industrial. In order to expand to socialist commerce, the North Korea absorbed all CC and aggressively expanded and reorganized. This strategy was very practical choice because, in fact, the North Korea did not have ability to create new distribution system. The CC main goal was they had to expel a bad merchant in North Korea for farmers and workers. If that happens, farmers and workers can have a stable living in North Korea. Following the strategy, the North Korea government and KWP actively recruited members who were farmers, workers, and office workers. Let's look at the table 2. In December 1948, workers and farmers take up 67.9% of all members. Officially, the North Korea and KWP forced them to join a CC. But I think a lot of farmers voluntarily became members because they already received the lands. The farmers who had their own land became consumers, so North Korea had to prevent them shopping from private retailers. However, CC did not have plenty of goods. Farmers and workers went to shopping to private shops that have more goods than CC. As a result of the pressure on private retailers, CC network increased rapidly. And by the end of 1949, private retailers accounted for 43.5% of all products distribution. But still, it was a burden, and the North Korea forced CC members to become red merchants to win the competition with private retailers. On August 1st, 1946, State Shop, one of the state commerce system, was established in Pyongyang. The first State Shop was department store. It was the Hwashin department store during colonial era was reorganized by North Korea commercial department. North Korea decided to establish department stores at cities from September 1946. The North Korea tried to attract consumers who were workers in the city to state shops. State shops were better than CC in every aspect. Even they sold imported products from Soviet. State shop was located in center of the city or near the markets. After that, the North Korea quickly expanded state shop in larger cities. Actually, state shop was for workers in the city. The North Korea intentionally supplied more daily necessities to workers than to farmers because they wanted to drive industries. According to the statistics at the time, the distribution ratio through CC and state shop was 50-50. Even though farmers accounted for more than 70% in the population, it means the North Korea focused more on workers. North Korean market could not be controlled by government. Meanwhile, CC and state shop were being established from place to place, but still workers and farmers just went to the market. State commerce network was not enough for active distribution. The North Korea unofficially permitted private retailers business. On March 1946, the North Korea announced to reform the commercial system gradually. In fact, the North Korea was not able to quickly reform the commercial system. As we know that private retailers were important for the people's life, North Korea government was totally aware of that. In order to manage the market, the North Korea began several policies that were registration of private merchant, display price, and permit to private merchant. Additionally, the North Korea reorganized permanent market that renamed the People's Market and organized several groups. For supervising market, the Commerce Department set up the Market Management Center. All private merchants were allowed to sell only in the market. Therefore, they could prevent to expand the market. Private merchants cleverly used the commerce network system. But some red merchants did not have good sales skill. Also, they did not follow government orders. They were only interested in achieving their goals. Private merchants took advantage of this. They could buy everything from red merchants. Then they resold it to farmers and workers. Despite of North Korea's regulations, private merchants survived by taking advantage of corrupted red merchants. I think the North Korean government knew what was happening, but they unofficially permitted them to sell goods for people's stable life. And North Korea gave private merchants a lower of distribution for farmers. On December 5th, 1947, SCA carried out currency reform. At the time, in the North Korea, 4 currencies were in circulation. There were US dollar, won, issued by Joseon Bank, ruble, Soviet notes. So the SCA and North Korea government faced currency problems, especially Soviet notes largely flow into North Korea market. It carried the price rising. This was an opportunity to make money every private merchant, but the SCA and North Korea government had to reform that for maintaining stable market and driving the state commerce. Immediately after currency reform, markets fell into chaos. One merchant commented, "Currency reform has been an axe strike on the head of speculators." Small private merchants could be accepted these situations, but and expected stable markets. But the big private merchant could not be accepted. They had a lot of currencies. However, they knew that the North Korea would not be fully exchanged. They thought it was going to be ruined. Big merchants instinctively knew they needed in kind. On December 5th, 1947, quick-witted big merchant with bunches of money went to countryside to buy the rice. At first, farmers were selling the rice with high price. After they knew currency reform, they asked for refund to big merchant. Farmers even confined big merchant if they refused. Big merchant plan failed. From 5th December to 10th, all shops did not open except CCs and state shops. As a result, CC members rapidly increased because farmers and workers joined the CC in order to buy goods and food. On the 10th December, the North Korean policy seems to be success. Big and small merchants thought were different. But they wait new government price better than prematurely reacted. Then big merchants sneakily asked for farmers to exchange money instead of big merchants. But this method is just a temporary measure in the market and boundary of commerce. All goods prices were up and down day by day. As a result, big merchants were reduced by currency reform that gain partially achieved. Finally, the North Korea announced new government price that were reduced 30 to 50%. Every people were disappointed about new price. They hopefully anticipated price that were going to reduce around 90%. But a few days after the rice price returned to 1,000 won, before currency reform, the farmers and workers, they seen new prices were raised. In practice, on the new prices, they could not maintain their lives from their incomes because of the North Korea policy was failed. They had to make more counterplans. The North Korea continually tried to expand the state commerce system despite of red merchant corruptions, but the people were not satisfied to a state commerce system. Farmers and workers wanted to buy more stuffs. So they went to private merchants that they were prepared everything and tried to look for customers. At the time, red merchants just waited for customers in their shops. In March 1950, the North Korea made a decision that created farmers markets. Farmers markets have a special feature. First of all, farmers market allowed only real farmers to sell their crops and handcrafts. Also, farmers could have chance to discount 30% to buy necessities from set shop and CC. Second of all, farmers markets intended to enforce a connection between farmers and workers. To achieve fair trade and secure enough products, farmers had to supply agricultural products to workers, and workers had to supply effective products to farmers. By doing so, the North Korean government thought that private merchants were going to be weakened. Private merchant increases tried to overcome these situations. They took advantage of corrupted commerce workers to buy lots of rice. Also, to enter the market at the farmers market, private merchant pretended to be a farmer. As a result, anyway, farmers market partially success because private merchants slightly reduced. However, people habitually bought necessities to their favorite shops. Considering this point, the North Korea tried to press private merchants and drive state commerce, but people's consumer habits were not quickly changed. The North Korea finished corporativization of private commerce in 1958. However, in order to help state commerce network, farmers markets officially exist until 1969. But as you know, that 장마당 was another name of farmers markets. This is important. I think farmers markets have never disappeared in North Korean history. Rather, the North Korea took advantage of farmers markets to maintain the people's lives. They always be concealed this fact from 1960 to 1990. I think farmers markets were a safety mechanism to sustain the North Korean regime. Today, I introduce a historical approach to understanding present-day 장마당 and private merchant in NK. Through this presentation, after liberation, we learned that the North Korea tried to build new commerce system, and they had partially succeeded before the Korean War. This commerce system actually maintained until the earliest March. Sometimes we ignore this fact. Also, lots of scholars are most interested in present North Korean commerce that is turning to capitalism. In order to fully understand present private merchant, we must know that history of survived private merchant in North Korean history. And then we all realize that 장마당 is not invented, but that was going on from unofficial market to official market after the arduous match. To sustain people's lives and regime, unofficially the North Korea allowed farmers markets and private merchants. At this point, the North Korea aggressively took advantage of farmers markets and private merchants that were enforced to circulating necessities. Considering these conditions, farmers market and private merchant were a safety mechanism to maintain the North Korean regime. Thank you. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Junhee, for this really interesting look at the crucible of the late 1940s and the interaction between what was going on the ground and the state's efforts to establish socialist commerce systems. I think it's a nice transition from the ideological focus of the previous presentation. I'm going to turn it over now to Bill Brown, who's already been introduced, but he's the leader of us, dear leader, as it were. So thank you. Here you go.
Thanks a lot, Junhee. It's a very interesting, good historical paper. And I'm not a historian, I'm an economist, but I think all of us love history, especially Korean history. And this just really strikes at an incredibly important time that we don't pay enough attention to, 1946 to 1950, when they were just creating the socialist system. Let me make a few points. I think especially your research is great, and I really like the use of Korean sources, which again, as I said earlier, is something that a lot of us Americans don't have, we don't pay enough attention to. And again, so an example of that is I've just written a chapter on Kim Il-sung's economy for a book that's going to come out, and I hope it's going to come out. And I wished I had been able to read your paper before I had written it. But there's one quote that's in the back of my mind that I just love, and I've not been able to source it. I've forgotten the source. The quote is very important to this topic, though. As a kind of a paraphrase, what I remember is Kim Il-sung saying at some point, quote, "Farmers' markets are the death knell of socialism. Someday they will be eliminated." So that's been in my head for years and years. I wrote it down, but I didn't write down the source. And now you have that in your paper. With the source, I can go to it. It's in Korean. I have to figure it out. I can read some Korean, but I have to now I can put the source to my thought. But it's a very important thought from Kim Il-sung, 1969. Farmers' markets are the death knell of socialism. We have to remember that, because this is what I think, is they really are. Markets are the death of this kind of command economy socialism that they're trying to create. So I kind of push back a little bit on the first panel that the idea is you can use both. No, I think it's one or the other. And I think that's the trouble in North Korea, is they're trying to do both of them. This idea of socialist commerce, it's kind of an odd word for a lot of us, because it's what is socialist commerce? Commerce is kind of market, so it's really kind of marketization. But I want to quote, reference a Chinese use of that term. Beijing Review, December 11th, 1970. The paper is called Orientation of China's Socialist Commerce. Socialist commerce is an important front in China's socialist revolution and socialist construction. By formulating a whole series of the theory, line, principles, and policies for commercial work, giving socialist commerce its orientation in solving the fundamental problems in running commerce under the dictatorship of the proletariat, our great leader, Chairman Mao, has developed Marxism-Leninism creatively and with genius. Now, the genius here, quote genius, is sort of allowing markets to happen in a way under a socialist system. This is his genius, so to speak. But then they go on to say, the hidden traitor and scab, Liu Shaoqi. Remember him? Liu Shaoqi was the number 2 in China for a long time. He was going to be Mao's successor. This is in 1969 at as the Cultural Revolution was coming into full sway. And he's really one of the 2 big, what do they call it? Capitalist rotors in Chinese history. The other one, of course, is Deng Xiaoping. The renegade, anyway, Liu Shaoqi sabotaged Chairman Mao's proletarian revolutionary line in an attempt to lead China's commerce on the vile road of capitalism. The history and setting up of the development of China's socialist commerce is one of repeated victories of Chairman Mao's proletarian revolutionary line over Liu Shaoqi's counter-revolutionary line. I bring that up to sort of note, first of all, the importance of this socialist commerce idea. In China, this is the turning point in Chinese communist history, the Cultural Revolution. And of course, it failed dismally. 5 years later, Deng Xiaoping takes over. And ultimately, Liu Shaoqi died. He was hammered by the Red Guard, treated incredibly badly, beaten up basically, and died of pneumonia a few years later. In 1980, he was sort of rehabilitated by the new government in China. Even Xi Jinping recently made a big speech in honor of Liu Shaoxi. So China has changed. China dramatically changed over this issue. A problem is North Korea has not changed over this issue. This is, I think, is their huge problem that we've got to let them recognize. They have to recognize it. We can't recognize it for them. The paper itself is great. I really like it. It's deep, involved, got a lot of historical sources. I would say the context, it would be helpful to have a little bit more context, where there's in a book or something, chapters on the side of it, giving a little bit of picture of North Korean economy in that period, in the late 1940s. Remembering that in 1945, it's something we all forget, Northern Korea was one of the most successful developed industrial areas in all of Asia. Even compared, Japan, of course, devastated. There was no war in Korea. There's no revolution. So when the Russians took over in 1945, there's, and this is again, one thing I would suggest, is you look at sources like the Wilson Center. I don't know if they're available in Korea, but the Wilson Center has this tremendous archive of diplomatic sources, where the diplomatic missions in Pyongyang, especially the East Europeans, but also Russians and China, and later on the Chinese, report in depth, in great in depth of what's going on here. And I refer especially to this report by a Lieutenant Colonel Fedorov in January of 1946, where he goes through what the Russians are doing there, the Soviets are doing there, and it's just absolutely appalling. It's his main picture is a Soviet commissar sitting. They've taken over the whole country. Every county seat has a Russian commissar running it, but they don't know Korean. They don't know any. They're uneducated. They're poorly educated. They don't have translators. His picture is of a Russian commissar sitting at a desk in a Korean county seat with a gun in the hand, and they've got food, they've got oil, they've got stuff, and so the Koreans are pouring in to try to get it, and he's commanding them with this gun. This is a Russian commissar, lieutenant colonel, who's complaining about this. Amazing situation as the Soviets take over Northern Korea. And one of his main points, though, is that, these people are not communists. They're not revolutionaries. Well, big surprise, right? They're very conservative Koreans. And, they kind of they don't like their landlords, but they're afraid of them. They don't want to get rid of their landlords. It's so unrevolutionary for this Russian to be looking at. And he kind of throws up his hands, says, we don't know what we're doing here. The Americans are doing much better in South Korea, is his point. So, I think looking at that kind of history and then real detailed stuff, they're all complaining, the East Europeans were all complaining, Russians, that North Korea was not building into the socialist system of trade, the Comecon system. A lot of interesting issues and becoming sort of self-reliant even at that point. So I think a good addition to your paper would be a discussion of that. And then another thing I find a little bit limiting, more than a little limiting, both in your paper and in the first session, not enough attention to the central planning mechanism. This is what the Russians are trying to bring in, central planning. Kim Il-sung at first doesn't seem to believe it. By 1956, he does believe it. And he tries to impose this central planning in industry, in other words, in the cities, but they can't do it in agriculture. So they're fighting this problem of a command economy in industry and not in agriculture. And the bridge is this sort of socialist commerce that you're talking about. But you really have to look at the planning problem to understand what they were trying to fix and how they were trying to get resources from the farms to the city. After all, that's what Marxism is all about, how to invest, how to get resources for investment without creating private capitalists. So I think a little bit more of that. Now, one thing I really congratulate you on, and I think you could pursue it further, is emphasizing this currency for reform in 1947, 8, the bank where they created the Central Bank of Korea. and basically eliminated money. They took all the money out of the system. Basically, that's a command economy. You can't use money. Socialist markets, the markets have to use money. So they pull the plug on the money, and the whole system basically collapsed. And that leads, so from North Korea being one of the richest parts of Asia in 1945, by 1990s, it's the poorest, and they have a massive famine. So I'm entirely critical of this whole system, but money has a huge part of it. And this is what's so important to today. The money has come back into the system, and that's where we can sort of, the currency reform that failed in 2009, so similar to what's going on. And now you have foreign money coming in, just like in the 1940s, a lot of foreign money. I think there's a lot of more work we can do on looking at how North Korean government has used or misused the concept of money throughout this whole process. Anyway, that's congratulations on a nice article, and I just think there's a lot more we can go with it.
Thank you very much, Bill, and to also Junhee for a fascinating presentation. We're going to turn to our final paper in this morning's panel, which is by Pil Kim, an assistant professor of Ohio State University. The paper is entitled "A 10 Times Faster Cholima, the Kangson Steel Mill and the Cultural Turn of North Korea's Mass Mobilization Campaign under Kim Jong Un." So we're moving forward in history, and my colleague Greg Brzezinski will comment or serve as discussant for this paper afterwards. So Pilo, go ahead.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank North Korean Economic Forum, GWIKS, and KDI School of Public Policy for inviting me to give a presentation on North Korea's mass mobilization campaigns and their cultural impact. Second, let me acknowledge my grad student and co-author, Michaela Cherry, for the work she put into this research. So let me share my screen quickly here. So I don't think I have enough time, but I'll try to go through this at Malima speed, really. While some regard the Cholima movement as little more than a pale imitation of USSR's Stakhanovite movement and China's Great Leap Forward, others have been engaged in comprehensive, historically nuanced research, especially the South Korean scholarship, elucidating Cholima's perspective despite its diminishing returns. I'd like to build on the latter line of research by critically re-examining the ongoing legacy of the Cholima movement in connection with the Kangsan Steel Mill. The steel mill became a genuine symbol and inspiration for the DPRK's economic success, the so-called Great Cholima Surge period. Although the steel mill's economic pull has dwindled in the subsequent decades, its cultural significance has not. It provided a backdrop for countless literary tributes to the model workers, so-called Cholima writers, and itself became a prime object for artistic renditions. As the birthplace of Cholima, it was summoned up once again in the second and third surge of mobilization campaign led by Kim Jong Un. Since the ascension of Kim Jong Un, the steel mill has turned into a premier filming location for 2 internationally circulated films. By analyzing these 2 movies, we attempt to show that the regime is projecting its new modern image to the outside world while instilling the myth of the continued success of the mobilization campaigns. In this context, Kim Jong-un's 2017 declaration on Malima, 10 times faster than Cholima, alludes to a subtle shift of emphasis from traditional heavy industries like steel to science and high technology, and perhaps even to culture and entertainment. And that's what I mean by cultural turn here. Those familiar with East Asia's political culture do not necessarily deny China's likely influence on Cholima. That's a great leap forward. Still, they are also aware of other comparable mass mobilization campaigns across the ideological divide, such as Imperial Japan's moral suasion campaigns and South Korea's New Village movement, Semaurundong. Cholima has shared cultural roots with its neighboring states, both friends and foes. The DPRK's official narrative on the origin of Cholima goes like this. Shortly after general meeting of Korean Workers' Party Central Committee, Kim Il-sung visited Kangsan Steel Mill for on-the-spot guidance, or 현지 지도, in December 1956. Speech in front of the steelworkers is credited as the catalyst for the movement. Initially, the new movement did not distinguish itself from previous labor mobilization campaigns in substance. However, there is a significant stylistic difference highlighted by the Kangsan origin story, that is, Kim Il-sung's direct personal appeal to the workers. The success of this leadership style brought a substantive change to the movement 2 years later. Once again, it immediately followed the great leaders on the spot guidance at Kangsan in February 1959. They began the nationwide campaign called the Chalima Work Team Movement. Many scholars see the work team movement as the real beginning of Chalima because it achieved increased production goals through collective means of technological innovation, new skills acquisition, and communist moral education. The Chalima movement established North Korea's own mass line, or Gunjung-nosan, that led to the Great Revolutionary Surge, widely considered as the best of the times in North Korean history. Its peak was the first 5-year plan period from 1957 to 1961, with the average annual GDP growth rate over 10%. Chalima created an enduring template, team-based labor competition, direct leader masses communication through on-the-spot guidance, and ideological edification campaign. Kangsan laid claim to the consolidation of the mass line in 1965 with the blessing of the great leader, who once again visited the steel mill. As the initial charge of Chalima was slowing down, the emphasis began shifting to ideological edification. In literature, the archetype of Chanhyang, of the Chalima rider, was first discussed after Kim Il-sung's November 1960 address. The iconography of Chalima was taking a step ahead of it. The 1958 poster already created a visual archetype that would recur in numerous propaganda artworks henceforth. The Chalima rider in the poster image is shooting a straight in the eye stare with an index finger pointed to the viewer, which bears an interesting resemblance to the famous "I Want You" poster for the US Army enlistment campaign. And more interestingly, the red horse in the poster does not possess wings that would later appear in most other Chalima images. Chalima literally means a horse that can run 1,000 li a day. That's approximately 250 miles a day. So it's an impossible yet imaginable creature with a bit of hyperbole. The Fergana horse is believed to have been the model for various versions of Chalima in traditional Asian lore because of its legendary endurance and speed. The non-flying Chalima in the 1958 poster echoes the concurrent discussion among literary theorists who argued that Chalima riders should possess, quote, the characteristics of communist social aesthetics without being, quote, portrayed as superhuman, end quote. Riding a flying horse would have been too outlandish for the principle of socialist realism, especially the realism part. But the thoughtful moderation did not last long. The iconography quickly scaled up to the gigantic Chalima statue erected in 1961. The 14-meter tall bronze horse statue has 2 wings fully spread to the sky. DPRK's Korean film studio has been using it in the opening and closing logo of many films since. Chalima's elevated status and the growing cult of personality in propaganda art also spotlighted at the Kangsan steel mill. The 1961 oil painting in Kangsan after the war is a depiction of young Kim Il-sung consulting with the steel workers at the mill. It goes back to the immediate aftermath of the Korean War in 1953, when Kim Il-sung visited the destroyed steel mill. The painting visualizes a historical and deeply personal relationship between the great leader and the steel workers, further mythologizing Kangsan as the birthplace of Chalima. The 1970s was a period of economic stagnation for the DPRK. More ominous than simple stagnation was the fact that South Korea's economy had caught up and left North Korea farther and farther behind since the mid-70s. DPRK's response was to dig its heels deeper in promoting the Chalima movement. Chalima was codified into the Socialist Constitution of 1972. And in 1978, another painting portrayed one of the defining features of the Chalima origin story. The layout of this 1978 painting by Chang Young-man is nearly identical to the 1961 painting, as the great leader at the center of the frame advises the workers surrounding him. They all listen closely to his words. One steelworker even takes notes. Both images present the supreme leader's on-the-spot guidance as the essence of the socialist general line. One conspicuous element that separates the 2 paintings is the overall color tone. The 1961 painting is dominated by a somber white color, except for Kim Il-sung wearing radiant, pure white clothes that highlights his presence. This color tone conveys the sorrowful mood of the workers gathered in front of the steel mill destroyed by the war. After all, white is the color of the traditional mourning dress in Korea. The 1978 painting, in contrast, is glowing scarlet and orange, the color of molten iron. While the supreme leader is distinguished by his black suit, even his face is glowing red because of the intense light and heat inside the steel mill. As such, the color of molten iron exudes the energy and liveliness of the Republic during the Great Chalima Surge. In fact, the scarlet and orange color came to represent Gangsan well before 1978 by the same painter, Jang Young-man. His masterpiece, Evening Glow over Gangsan, portrays the Chalima legacy without displaying the worker, soldier, or great leader as is typical of socialist propaganda art. The picture shows the steel mill sitting on the edge of Tadong River. As smoke comes out of the top of factories' funnels, the sunset casts the sky in hues of scarlet, orange, and dark reds. In hindsight, though, the beautiful sunset of Gangsan might be better interpreted as a sign of declining vigor, like Chalima flying into the twilight. The unmet goals of the economic plans and general stagnation forced the regime's hands to seek new ways to motivate workers and increase industrial outputs. In December 1967, the adoption of the Three Revolutions movement, 3대 혁명운동, took the first step of replacing Chalima movement. Kim Jong-il oversaw the new campaign, using it as a stepping stone for his succession of power. The final step of the replacement was taken in 1992 as the constitutional revision removed the Chalima movement and inserted the Three Revolutions movement in its stead. The devastating famine and the collapse of the economy put the DPRK in crisis mode. In 1998, Kim Jong-il put into full effect Sungun policy and brought the Chalima movement back the next year, 1999. The second Great Chalima March saw a slight rise in GDP, heavy industry output, and steel production, but overall disappointing results prompted the DPRK to quietly drop Second Chalima March without a trace. Undaunted, Chalima came roaring back a decade later. The third round of Chalima began as the deal leader Kim Jong-il visited the old Gangsan mill, now called the Chalima Steelworks, literally following in his father's footsteps. But the deal leader was also aware that the DPRK needed new, more advanced symbols of 21st century science and technology, even as it was still relying on the past glory of the Great Chalima Surge. On September 1st, 2008, Nodong Shinmun ran an editorial stating the general, Kim Jong-il, has opened up the speed battle, Sokdojeon era, by putting the people on the 10,000 li horse, Malima. Thus, the neologism of Malima first appeared not quite yet as a new symbol, but as hyperbole, a 10 times faster Chalima. But with his demise in 2011, the third round of Chalima came to a premature end. Then it was the young, untested leader's turn to ride the old horse and let it fly. So the 2012 film, Comrade Kim Goes Flying, represents the beginnings of an ideological and economic shift into the younger Kim's era. A co-production with Belgian and British filmmakers, the story follows Young-mi, a woman in her late 20s who excels in surpassing production quotas as a coal miner in countryside. After going to Pyongyang to participate in a construction project, Young-mi's dream of becoming a trapeze artist is reinvigorated. With the help of some working-class comrades, she succeeds in joining acrobatics team and wins multiple competitions overseas. So on the surface, this film has little to do with Chalima, except for one prominent location, that is the Gangsan steel mill and its scarlet glow from molten iron. Young-mi visits the steel mill to have acrobatic equipment made for practice. The film does not simply fall into a propaganda trope or the Chalima rider archetype of the past. This avoidance was a major result of the unprecedented collaboration between North Korea and the West. The Western filmmakers discuss how they were able to work with the North Korean director. Quote, "We fed the director the girl power theme and feeling girl power theme and feeling and guided the film towards comedy and romance, rom-com, in order to bring it as close as possible to the magical fairy tale we had originally had in mind," end of quote. As an important mise-en-scène in the film, the Gangsan steel mill allows for Chalima to insinuate itself into the romantic comedy narrative. Far from being satisfied with the tired old labor hero status, which she has already accomplished as a minor. The heroine of the younger generation, and a peer of the newly emerging leader Kim Jong Un, aims for a bigger role for herself. Thanks to the help of the Cholima steelworkers at Gangsan, she finally reaches her spectacular goal, which in a subtle yet significant way indicates Cholima's cultural turn from a workhorse to a show horse. The Malima movement came into prominence during Kim Jong-un's new 5-year economic strategy period from 2016 to 2020. While echoing the 3 rounds of Cholima in the past, Malima made 2 notable adjustments. First, since Kim Jong-un's Pyeongjin parallel development policy, the focus of the economic policy has been shifting from the heavy industry to service and light industry sector. As if to confirm this shift, Kim Jong-un kicked off the Malima movement by visiting a textile factory, not a steel mill, for his on-the-spot guidance in January 2016. Second, Malima has elevated science and technology as the rallying point. The Malima propaganda poster upgraded the original Cholima poster by adding an image of a rocket next to the soaring winged horse. The 2020 New Year postage stamp shows another winged horse flying over a futuristic spaceship-shaped building, the Science and Technology Park in Pyongyang, built in 2015. Starting under Kim Jong-il, construction projects for scientists and high-tech industry workers flourished in 21st century North Korea. Malima sped up such spectacular high-rise buildings and futuristic urban mega projects in Liamyang Street, a newly developed area in Pyongyang. However, Malima is widely considered a bust as a mass mobilization campaign. The GDP growth rate briefly went up to 4% in 2016, only to plunge to -4% in the next two years. On the propaganda front too, Malima seems to have suffered from a lack of passion and creativity. It was not for the lack of trying, though. The problem was failure to create a new archetype for the Malima rider. The archetypal Cholima rider was an industrial worker, like the smelter at Gangsan Mill. Riders of Malima tried to make a national hero out of a rocket scientist or computer programmer, but it failed to resonate with the masses because of the distant nature of their work from people's daily lives. One exception may be found in the 2016 film, The Story of Our Home. Based on a true story, the movie follows Lee Jung-ah, an 18-year-old woman who decides to care the 3 blood-related orphans. Her real-life counterpart named Chang Jung-hwa won the Kim Il-sung Youth Honor Award, and Rodong-sinmun referred to her as the daughter of the working class in Gangsan. Indeed, the film takes the viewer to the hometown of Cholima, but it does not really feature the steel mill too much. Jung-hwa works at the public catering department, not at the steel mill. There are obligatory scenes paying tribute to the late supreme leaders. Jung-hwa tells the orphans the story of 2 past Cholima campaigns as they walk down the path the leaders once took. After that, they go to the steel mill once again to view the memorials and paintings of the leaders on the spot guidance. The film shows very little of steelmaking process, though. And this is surprising given that the scarlet glow inside a steel mill figures so prominently in Comrade Kim Goes Flying just 4 years prior. But it makes sense if the goal of the story of our home is to create a new archetype for Malima. The main character, Jung-ah, provides a role model and moral compass, yet her occupation does not inspire the new lofty goals of Malima. Herein comes another character named Eun-jung, the eldest among the orphans and a math prodigy. At first, Eun-jung's headstrong independence makes it difficult for her to accept Jung-ah as motherly caretaker. Eventually, though, Jung-ah wins Eun-jung over and let her talent flourish. Reviewing the Kim Jong-un era mass culture, Tatiana Gabrusenko says, quote, Malima culture has changed the generational perspective into a more youth-centered one, with young people portrayed as decision makers and the focus of narratives, and with Gangseong-daegu, that is strong and prosperous country, giving rise to the slogan strong youth country, 청년 강국. Both Jung-ah and Eun-jung belong to the strong youth category, and Eun-jung in particular represents the promise of advanced science and technology the DPRK is eager to harness through Malima. Gangsan, the steel mill, the old generation of steel workers and their comrades are assisting and nurturing this young generation in the background. As the Cholima generation fades into the twilight, the new Malima generation rises from the dawn. This generational change may be able to complete another cultural turn of North Korea's mass mobilization campaign. Well, that is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think your paper with Michaela really gives us a great glimpse into the wide array of sources that we have available for analyzing North Korean society and their interaction with the state, which is adjusting itself over time. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn it now to my colleague, Greg Brzezinski, for discussant comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and apologies. As soon as I start talking, there's like a fire truck going off in the background. But very good to see you. And yeah, so I think when Yunho told me or asked me to speak at the North Korea Economic Forum, I was at first sort of like, what's this? I'm not really an economist. And I'm not going to know what I'm doing. But I said, okay. And when I saw this paper by Pyo-ho Kim, I was actually very much relieved because it's not really a paper, as you know, about the economic effects of the Cholima movement per se, but it's about the iconography of the Cholima movement and how this iconography is being used and recreated. First, how it has been used over time, and second of all, how it's sort of been recreated by a new generation of North Koreans through Malima and through more recent developments. And I find this in general to be an extremely valuable and important point. And I think that as a whole, the paper uses this iconography and images, films in an extremely productive way. So I think, I think all of that I give the author a lot of credit for. I think today's North Korean state is still in so many ways dependent on narratives of dissent from its idealized past for legitimacy. And Cholima and the economic successes of the 1950s and 1960s are very crucial to that. They're very important parts of that. And I think Cholima itself is so critical to the overall legacy of Kim Il-sung that it makes sense that it's something that would still figure into how North Korea views and advertises parts of its heroic past. And as a Cold War scholar, I also like how this paper traces this policy that was devised under Cold War circumstances, and it really shows how these legacies of the Cold War are with us, not just the East-West confrontation aspect of the Cold War, but also developmentalism and these two competing models, or at least I guess you could actually say various competing models of economic development. How are they still with us? How are their legacies still with us? And I think the paper is really good in that it forces us to think about that a little bit. So I had a few sort of specific points in the paper that I wanted to comment on. Some of them are things that are personal points of interest to me. Some of them are places that I would appreciate or would like to see a little bit more detail, although I certainly realize that when you're doing research about North Korea, there's a lot of constraints on what you can do. And so sometimes bringing forth these additional details isn't possible. But first of all, in the paper, you talked more about the relationship between Cholima and the Great Leap Forward. Where are they similar? And I think you actually make another good point here. I agree that we can point to similarities between Cholima and the Great Leap Forward without necessarily saying that Cholima is a pale imitation. And you use that phrase. It's also a phrase used by a number of other scholars who write about North Korea. It's not a pale imitation. I do think that they used, I mean, clearly Cholima duplicated some of the spirit and slogans of the Great Leap Forward. For instance, the Chinese used this phrase "zili gangshang," and the North Koreans said "jaryok gangsang," and both of them mean basically the same thing, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. But at the same time, I think it's important to remember that North Korea also distanced itself from many aspects of the Great Leap Forward, and they didn't just blindly imitate all dimensions of it. And if you look at conversations between Chinese officials and North Korean officials at the time of the Great Leap Forward, I find that the Chinese officials actually found a lot that was admirable in what the North Koreans were doing. And they spoke very candidly that this was also an opportunity for mutual learning. And so that's just something that I've been working on. I've been working on a book on Sino-North Korean relations. But in terms of this contrast, it's so interesting because today nobody in China is calling for a second Great Leap Forward. But in North Korea, you have this ongoing romanticization of the Cholima movement. Source materials are something I wonder if you could do more with that. I think you seem to use predominantly visual materials, paintings and movies. And I would credit you. Your images, not only are they striking, but in your PowerPoint you had extremely high quality digital images. So I hope you can also give some insights on how you did that. It was just very impressive. It really draws you in when you have that video from Comrade Kim Goes Flying, or that clip of the arm wrestle. Like, I really want to know who wins that arm wrestle. Very, very, I think they're very good. But at the same time, I also wonder, about textual sources. Are there more textual sources that can strengthen this analysis? I know there's tons of North Korean economic journals from the 1950s and 1960s, and I've seen a number of recent scholars use them to great effect. Nam-hee Lee at UCLA has a student, and Thomas Stock, that's his name. He's used them. My own former student, James Person, is also using these economic journals. I realize that's not exactly what you're going for, but I think these journals also, in terms of producing discourse about Cholima, played a very important role. So I wonder if your analysis could be enriched a little bit when the Library of Congress, it actually is reopening, and a lot of their stuff is, the journals themselves aren't online, but they have a very good index that's online. So I wonder if you can enrich the visuals in this paper with some more textual sources and analysis. I also think you focus heavily on the production side. And, I've already talked about these images, but I wonder, it's much harder to know about the impact of these images. And this is, of course, a perennial problem in North Korean studies because we're so dependent on sources that are produced by the state. But I still sort of wonder, is there anything more that could be that you could say about reception? I think in the ending of this paper, you talk about how one of your goals is to help us to better understand the daily lives of North Koreans. And I think that's an area where it's difficult to get at that completely if you just look at the production side. So, I think there's a lot of different ways you might look at this. One way is to look at reviews that were written of these works. And I think if you look at like Chosun Yonghwa and some of the other North Korean arts and film journals, Chosun Yesul, some of Chosun Misul as well. Sometimes they have reviews, and of course, even the reviews, they're tended to guide reception and feelings of the audience, but they can still give some sense of sort of how the state, what kind of feelings did the state try to produce? What kind of reception did it try to produce? I also wonder if we could know more about the producers themselves. I think right now, in much of the paper, there's sort of a discussion of the films and the visuals, but there's not as much discussion of the people who made the films and what their motives may have been. There's this sort of, almost throwaway line about how Comrade Kim Goes Flying was co-produced with British and Belgium filmmakers, and it's just how does that happen? That's something that I was also interested in. But I think this is also something that would be difficult to get at. But nonetheless, I think understanding a little bit more about what the producers were thinking, as a historian, that's something I'm very interested in. I realize, maybe people in film studies, they're less interested in authorial intent, and they're just sort of interested in analyzing the film. But as a historian, I think it would be interesting to hear about, to know more about that as well. But I'll end there. And again, my comments, they're more really just suggestions for directions I personally would be interested in. I think on the whole, you have some very, very productive discussion in this paper about the symbolism of Cholima and why that retains its value in contemporary North Korea.
Thank you very much, Greg. We're going to shift gears now to the Q&A. So if I can ask Junhee, Susie, and Ellie to turn on their cameras so we can simulate a panel here, that would be helpful. Thank you. And I'm going to take the liberty of extending our time until 11:10 to give us more time to engage in a discussion here. And so I think we have a number of different productive avenues of questioning, both comparing the markets that existed in the 40s and 50s early on with what's been studied actively after the arduous march. We also have some interesting common points between Susie's questions and Greg's recent questions and comments about the role of intellectuals or economists and producers, and the material that they produced, what was their role, the agency of these actors, is something interesting that we can consider. So I'm going to turn it first to Ellie. We'll just go in the order of the three presenters. So Ellie, if you want to respond to Susie's comments as well, that would be helpful.
Thank you so much for your insight comment. I think Dr. Kim's comment was the best I ever received. And I think, and also I think Dr. Kim lives pretty close from me, so I always wanted to see her. So it was really great to see her here. Dr. Kim mentioned several important points, and the first one was my theoretical approach to characterizing socialist economy, and she suggests whether we can also regard the North Korean marketization as a social experience. I think right now it is true that it's still a mixed economy, and it is a part of socialist practice. But I think that there is a significant difference between capitalism and socialism, which is, I think it's the ideology that how socialism still have this ideological justification for economic equality, which is the distribution of a product or wealth. So in fact, that my main point was to debunk this, the notion of the socialist economy as if it is combining the capitalist practices, and is considered as some sort of diluted form of socialism. But I think you're right in a sense that if I push the idea of debunk this socialism and capitalism, and would say what is the difference? So I guess I need to work that part more, And another, the important thing that you mentioned about is about the role of intellectual and how is that how ask how socialist intellectual discourse or North Korean intellectual discourse actually translate into practice. And I think that's why I use intellectual, because it's really hard to understand and look into North Korea's everyday people's life. And I think intellectual discourse does actually show kind of very conflicting interest. So in a way, a socialist intellectual as a producer of state ideology, they does really push the state ideology, but at the same time, you can see that it's nuanced, their argument, and they tries to persuade, their people that they don't follow the state ideology, or sometimes they understand that they're where the situation they're in, and then try to bring that the concern. So I think still this is a very important comment or point that you addressed. And I think there are many others, but I don't want to occupy all this Q&A session. So if there's something come up, I will mention some other stuff.
Thank you very much, Ellie. I forgot to mention there is simultaneous interpretation during this Q&A. So if you want to use the button at the bottom of your screen, don't forget to click that. So I'm going to turn now to Junhee, and there was a question. So if I can kind of direct your comments in response to Bill's discussant comments. There was a question about sort of comparing North Korea's the market activity in the 50s with what's going on today. And if I wonder if you could specifically illuminate some of that, whether you see, you talked about this being like a pressure valve or a safety valve for the regime to allow private entrepreneurial activity. That's a similar interpretation of the post-arduous march markets in North Korea today or in the last 2 decades. So what points do you see similarities between the two time periods, and what points do you see different?
네, 우선 이 포럼을
First of all, and thank you. And Bill was my commentator. Thank you very much. And I'm not sure whether I can cover everything or not. So I'm going to revisit my writing based on your comments and based on what you said and Kim Il-sung's comment that the farmers market should be gone. And that's something that is common in the socialist economies like the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, whatever that may be, because the market itself should be gone within the socialist regime. Within the Soviet Union, they had the goal to remove the money or the cash. However, within the real socialistic environment, as you said, that is practically impossible. The socialist commerce is a strange term or the jargon, as you said, Bill, and we needed to have a new perspective, how we can view that. And you introduced the Chinese article, and I'm gonna look into it. I'm gonna read the Chinese article and quote within my papers. In the 1945, within the Soviet Union, and you said that the Soviet Union guys are forcing North Korea, and there was a comment about the SCA. Actually, the Soviet Union at the time was not interested in the development of the North Korean society development. They just wanted to keep the status quo at the time. And they simply wanted to keep the North Korea as it is so that it cannot be threatened by the US. Once again, they simply wanted to keep the status quo of the society as it was. So compared to the East European countries, well, the Soviet guys did not provide lots of the support, and did not push North Koreans so hard, and Kim Il-sung was aware of that kind of intention of the Soviet Union at the time. In that regard, the currency reform you mentioned, well, when I was writing down the article about the currency reform, I mainly focused on the impact of the currency reform to many of the commerce guys or the private shops. However, there was too much note coming from the Soviet Union, and that was not kept that well. There was inflation. North Korean regime conducted currency reform to get away from that inflation. Within North Korea, they wanted to stabilize the market economy within themselves rather than having the transaction with the other countries. Then what can be the meaning of the currency reform for North Korean regime? And at that time, they wanted to have the citizen-led democracy on their own, and they wanted to utilize some aspects of the capitalism. In the 1956 and after the 1961 and after the introduction of the Chuche, they wanted to hide that kind of a spirit, which means even though they failed in the currency reform, they wanted to hide that. There was a market, but they denied the existence of the market. When they denied the existence of the market, the society was instabilized. And as you know, they should have the products to have the commerce system. However, the products were usually farm products. And as you know, agriculture is prone to natural disaster, and it was heavily dependent on the soil, which was poorly nourished at the time. They did not have a good supply of the farm supplies at the time. As for the commercial or the manufacturing goods, the quality was really poor. So the commerce system was not that effective. Considering all that, I can say the meaning of the currency reform is really insignificant. Even though they have the cash or the currency, well, the role of the China is really big. And as you said, when you take a look at the market activities between now and in the 1950s, well, I want to reflect on the past and interpret the present. However, as Bill said, Mao, Liu Shaoqi, and the Deng Xiaoping wanted to make a heavy leap forward. However, in North Korea, that kind of concept, well, North Korea cannot give up the socialist economy totally. However, they are at the turning point and they need to adopt the new model, whether it can be Chinese style or the Vietnamese style. However, I would say that North Korea has never been isolated. They've been having trade relations with many other countries, like African countries and many other countries. The farmers market or 장마당 is currently kept. As I told you, that means the farmers market or 장마당 can be the foundation for their regime. So the North Korean regime does not have a strong drive to make a further innovation. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Junhee. So I'm going to give the final word to Pilo, and I want to group 3 questions together to focus your answer a little bit. And these relate to the messaging in the propaganda to encourage workers or North Korean citizens or farmers And whether you see the messaging changing across time, or to what extent, what is the content of the message? Why should people work hard? Should they work hard to live better or to benefit the state or to be safer? And do you see the kind of encouragement dimension of the propaganda associated with the Cholima movement or the Malima movement taking a slightly different tenor as you looked across this content? Thank you.
Well, thank you for all the questions. I don't think I have enough time to address all of those, but I'll try my best. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Brzezinski for all those helpful comments. Let's see. So the central question here is the messaging issue, and I think on the basic level, it hasn't really changed. So it's at the core, it's about mobilization, mass mobilization for labor, and they focus on the speed of production and of course output. But I think there's a subtle shift of focus, and that sort of reflects how North Korea sees where the future of its economy and the country's fortune lies. So started with, of course, heavy industry, and that's the origin of Cholima, and that's why Gangsan, the steel mill, became really kind of had a symbolic, not only symbolic value, but also its importance in terms of North Korean economy. But over time, as we saw that the steel industry and heavy industry in general plummeted, right? And more and more they focus on, especially since 2000. This kind of a new economy, knowledge economy or high-tech economy, whatever you call it. So that is sort of reflected on the mass mobilization movement too, and that actually goes back to Kim Jong-il's effort to sort of update Cholima. So they first came up with this three revolutions movement, and one of the revolutions about technology, and more. Even though they had to sort of put it in the back burner and bring the Cholima back, because that's what the masses are familiar with, and that's what has been really romanticized and had a pull. So even though they brought back Cholima and with the image of steel and all of that, they try to sort of change it very in a subtle way to shift the focus from the heavy industry to more high tech, knowledge, science, that sort of thing, and even I might say with the new cultural products like films and dramas and things like that, they might want to shift to a more to the cultural side of it, and that's what I mean by cultural turn. Yeah, I think there is quite a bit of a shift, but the underlying message is I guess still very much the same.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. There's still so many questions, everything about reception and how North Koreans' lives are affected by this ideology that mixes communism and social and capitalism, as well as the messaging or the propaganda from the regime of encouraging harder work and speed, and what their relationship is with the private entrepreneurial activity that goes on in daily lives as they're busy living and putting food on the table. I think in the further discussions, we're going to unpack what not just the structures of the economy are, but how this affects North Korean lives. And so I'm going to conclude this morning's panel, but thank you to our speakers and our discussants for a thought-provoking set of papers. And thank you very much, audience, for joining in with some questions. Thank you.